When I finally decided to follow through on that trip, I felt like I was forcing myself out of the comfort of a normal routine. It was so easy to sit at home after work, sink into the couch, and let another day pass without anything memorable. But the more I thought about it, the more restless I got. I wasn't getting any younger, and if I kept putting it off, I knew I'd never do it. So I packed up the RAV4 and got myself ready. I cleaned it out completely, making space for sleeping in the back if I had to. I laid down blankets, a pillow, and tucked in some emergency gear, water jugs, food that didn't need cooking, a flashlight, batteries, and a couple knives. I even packed a small survival kit with waterproof matches, paracord, and a first aid pouch. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to feel like I had some control if things went wrong. The thought of actually sleeping in the back of the car out in the woods was uncomfortable, but that was part of the reason I wanted to do it. Roughing it, even just for a little while, felt like a challenge I needed. I left Boise around 6 in the evening, just like I planned. Traffic was light, and once I was outside of the city, the road stretched out quiet and long. The sky was painted in layers of orange and purple, fading fast into blue. By the time I was crossing into the more rural stretches, darkness had already swallowed up the horizon. I had music playing, but it felt thin compared to the silence pressing in outside. Driving toward Libby, Montana, took me into areas where the roads narrowed and the trees crowded in on both sides. There were long stretches with no lights, no houses, no signs of life at all. Just miles of asphalt cutting through endless forest. Every so often my headlights would catch the eyes of a deer on the shoulder, glowing for a second before disappearing back into the black. It was a reminder of how alone I was out there. I kept stopping here and there, partly to stretch, partly to take GPS screenshots like I had planned. I wanted to keep a record, almost like proof that I was really doing this. It made me feel grounded, but the deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of isolation. Gas stations and small towns became fewer and farther apart. Once I left Libby and started heading back down that old route I remembered from years ago, it was like stepping into another world. The road was rougher than I recalled, narrow and patched in places, with long curves that hugged the slopes of dark ridges. The forest was thick, pine trees towering and swaying slightly in the cool night breeze. Their tops looked sharp against the starlit sky. My headlights barely carved out more than a tunnel through the dark. At one point, I pulled off onto a gravel turnout and shut the car down to rest. I left the windows cracked just enough for air, locked the doors, and crawled into the back. The silence was immediate and heavy. Out there, no sound of traffic or city hum reached me. Instead, there were soft rustlings in the underbrush, twigs snapping occasionally, and the distant rush of water, maybe a creek down the slope. Lying there, I realized how vulnerable I was. A thin sheet of metal and glass was all that separated me from the forest. My survival gear felt laughably small compared to the immensity of the wilderness pressing in on me. Every sound made me lift my head, waiting to hear if it was just the wind or something moving. I didn't sleep much, just drifted in and out, checking the time on my phone whenever I woke. When morning came, the forest looked different, less threatening, more alive. Mist hung low between the trees, and sunlight filtered in slowly. I drove further, pushing deeper into the woods along the same route I had walked all those years ago. It was strange to see some landmarks I faintly remembered. A bend in the river, a rock formation near the road, but also how much had changed. Some parts were overgrown, trails barely visible anymore. I stopped often to take photos and notes in my log. I was looking for something familiar, but I didn't know exactly what I expected to find. Maybe I thought I'd stumble across the same strange sense of mystery I had back then. The truth is, I was half excited, half on edge. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of other people I saw. No campers, no hunters, no cabins. Just forest. The quiet was so thick that even the crunch of my boots on gravel when I stepped out of the car sounded too loud. Around mid-afternoon, I parked by a clearing that opened into a wide view of the mountains. It was beautiful, but what struck me was how completely alone I was. As I sat there eating some snacks, I kept catching myself glancing back at the tree line. The feeling of being watched wasn't constant, but it came in waves. I'd shrug it off, but then a bird would suddenly stop calling, or a branch would crack in the distance, and I'd feel my stomach tighten. It was probably just wildlife, but when you're that far removed from anyone else, your mind starts turning every sound into a threat. That night, I set up in the back of the car again, this time farther from the road. I thought I'd sleep better after being tired all day, but instead, the unease grew stronger. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, crunching through leaves outside. I froze, holding my breath, staring at the dark windows. It could have been an elk, maybe even a bear, but the steps paused near the car and then nothing. No breathing, no movement, just silence. I stayed still for almost an hour, barely blinking, clutching the knife I had by my side. Eventually, I dozed off out of pure exhaustion, but the fear stayed in my chest even as I slept. When I woke in the morning, there were impressions in the dirt near the back of the car. I crouched down to look at them. They weren't clear, just smudges in the soil, but they weren't the hoof prints of a deer or elk. They looked human. That was the moment I realized the risk wasn't just the forest or the wildlife. People could be out there too, and not all of them the kind you'd want to run into in the middle of nowhere. I decided then that I'd had enough. I drove back out, stopping only when I reached towns where I could fuel up. The forest looked less like an adventure and more like a reminder of how small and exposed I really was. By the time I made it back toward Boise, the whole trip sat heavy in my head. I didn't find answers. I didn't uncover anything shocking. But I did feel what it's like to be truly alone out there, surrounded by miles of wilderness with no one to call and nowhere to run if something went wrong. That was real enough. And those faint impressions in the dirt, I'll never know if they were from another hiker, a hunter, or someone else living far off the grid. But when I think about them, I still feel that same cold rush in my chest. It reminded me that the deep woods don't care about comfort or safety. Once you're in, you're at the mercy of whatever's out there, and sometimes that's more frightening than anything you can imagine. I was still young when I went on that hike in Romania sometime in the early 90s. Communism had just fallen not long before, and the country was still adjusting, still raw in a lot of ways. I didn't fully understand the political changes at the time, but I could feel the difference in the air. There was a sense that the world had suddenly cracked open, but in some places you wouldn't even know anything had changed at all. That trip into the deep woods showed me just how far apart people could live, even in the same country. We had started out as a group of friends, eager to do something different from our usual routines. Hiking up in the mountains felt like freedom. We didn't have cell phones, of course, nobody really did then, and the lack of connection didn't bother us at first. It was just us, backpacks, water bottles, and a trail that wound up into thick forests and high ridges. The path was long and demanding. We had gone more than 10 kilometers, maybe closer to 14, when we came across something none of us had expected to find. A small homestead, tucked away so deep in the mountains it felt impossible. There was a house made of wood, old but sturdy. Next to it, a barn, and behind a crooked fence, a few animals, cows, chickens, even a pig or two. It wasn't an abandoned ruin like we might have expected. It was alive. At first glance, it didn't seem threatening, just strange. What unsettled us wasn't that people lived there, but how they looked at us when they stepped outside. A man came forward, and behind him, 5 or 6 women hovered at a distance. Their clothes were plain and old-fashioned, the kind you didn't see much anymore even in rural areas. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank, almost hollow, as if time moved differently for them. The man tried to speak to us, and though we could catch some words, much of it was hard to understand. He asked us questions that felt completely out of place, like who the president was. It struck me then just how isolated they must have been. These weren't people who had newspapers delivered to their door, or even radio signals to rely on. Their world stopped at the fence with their cows and chickens. When he offered us milk, the gesture might have been kind, but something about the whole encounter felt wrong. It wasn't only the language barrier or their outdated look. It was the way the women stood back, never stepping closer, their eyes flicking between us and the man as though they were waiting for his command. He seemed to guard them or maybe control them, it was hard to tell which. The more I looked at their faces, the more unease spread through me. We tried to act calm, but none of us wanted to stay. My heart was thudding in my chest as my friend politely declined the milk and said we had to keep moving before it got dark. We walked away at a steady pace, pretending nothing was wrong. Only when the house was no longer in sight did we let the panic take over, breaking into a run as though something might be chasing us. By the time we stopped, the sun was already dipping low. We set up camp on a flat stretch of ground, but none of us could really relax. We organized shifts, keeping someone awake through the night. Every rustle in the trees made us tense. Every shadow seemed like it might belong to someone following us. The fear wasn't of wild animals, it was of those people, or rather, of what we didn't understand about them. Morning brought no relief. We walked for hours until we finally reached the villages at the base of the mountain. The first thing we did was tell the locals what we had seen. Their reaction was disbelief. They insisted no one lived up there, not in that area. To them, the mountains were empty aside from the odd shepherd. The way they dismissed us only made the memory more disturbing. We knew what we had seen, and the fact that people who lived nearby had no idea only deepened the mystery. Looking back on it now, with more knowledge of how things were back then, I can make sense of it in ways I couldn't as a teenager. Romania had pockets of extreme isolation, especially before the 2000s when cable television and internet started reaching the far corners. There were places with no electricity, no phone lines, no real connection to the outside world. People survived off their land, living much the way their ancestors had for generations. Maybe the family we saw was one of those. Maybe they only came into contact with outsiders occasionally, selling milk or cheese to passersby when they got the chance. The question about the president wasn't strange for them. They truly wouldn't have known. For us, though, seeing people living like that just after communism fell made it feel eerie, like stepping into a world that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Even with that explanation, I can't shake the unease of that day. It wasn't just that they were isolated. It was the way they looked at us, the way the women hung back, the way the man's eyes lingered on our clothes and boots as though weighing them against his own world. We were outsiders, intruders, and in that moment it felt like we were vulnerable in ways we didn't even want to imagine. If we had stayed longer, maybe they would have been harmless. Maybe they just wanted to share milk, to make contact with people who lived in a different reality. Or maybe there was more going on than we realized. We never found out, and honestly, I'm glad for that. To this day, when I think of those deep woods in Romania, I don't picture the mountains or the trail. I picture that house, standing in a clearing with smoke-less chimneys and silent women in the background. I picture the man asking questions about the world, questions whose answers should have been obvious to anyone living in it. And I picture us walking away calmly, then running with our hearts pounding, grateful for the distance that grew between us and them. We never saw that place again. The villagers insisted it wasn't there, and eventually we stopped talking about it. But even now, more than 30 years later, I remember it clearly. I remember the fear, the confusion, and the sense of being caught between two worlds, one that was moving forward and one that had been left behind in the deep woods. And I still know without a doubt that if we hadn't trusted our instincts that day, the story might not have ended with us walking out of those mountains at all. I've lived in Alaska most of my life, but no matter how long I stay here, there's one thing that always unsettles me more than anything else. It's not the predators, though there are plenty. Bears, wolves, even the rare mountain lion that strays too far north. It's not the cold, even when the air burns your skin with every breath. It's not the isolation, though that's part of it. What really gets to me, what makes me feel like I'm walking too close to the edge of something dangerous, is the silence in winter. I'm not talking about ordinary quiet. I mean the kind of silence that presses in on you so hard you start hearing your own body working. The type where your breathing sounds like it's tearing through the air, and your heart feels like a drum someone's beating inside your chest. I've spent nights out there where I was convinced that if I coughed or even swallowed too loudly, something would notice. But the truth is, there's nothing. That's the part that terrifies me, the knowledge that there isn't a soul within miles. If I dropped dead in that moment, I'd freeze where I fell, buried in snow, and nobody would ever know where I'd gone. One winter a few years ago, I had an experience that stuck with me in a way nothing else has. I was staying in my cabin, which sits far enough from the nearest road that once the snow gets deep, you're basically locked in unless you use a snowmobile or skis. That year, I had taken some time off work and decided to live mostly off the supplies I'd stored. It wasn't unusual for me. I liked the quiet, usually. I liked the space to think, the time away from people. But after weeks of being alone, even I started to crave something. It was late January, maybe the coldest stretch of that year. Nights dipped well below -30, and even during the day, the sun only gave a weak glow, hanging low and tired above the horizon. I remember waking up one morning and deciding I needed to stretch my legs beyond chopping wood or hauling water. I strapped on my snowshoes, packed a small bag with a thermos of coffee and some jerky, and headed out into the tundra behind the cabin. At first, the crunch of my snowshoes against the crust gave me comfort. It was steady, familiar, a reminder that I was still here, still moving. The air was so sharp it burned the inside of my nose, and every breath came out in a thick plume. I followed a line of stunted spruce trees, their thin branches frosted white, until I reached an open stretch of tundra. The land there looked endless, rolling slightly but otherwise flat, with patches of brush poking through the snow. The sky stretched above me, pale and cloudless, an empty ceiling over an empty world. After a while, I stopped to drink from the thermos. I pulled the cap off, steam rising against my face, and that's when I realized it. There was nothing. No wind moving across the land. No crack of tree limbs under snow. Not even the faint creak of ice shifting in the ground. Just stillness. It was so complete that at first it felt peaceful. But the longer I stood there, the more it pressed in. The silence wasn't just around me. It was inside me. My ears strained for anything, even a crow's call or the distant snap of a frozen branch. There was nothing. My breath sounded obscene, tearing the quiet apart, and my heartbeat pounded in my skull like a hammer. I swallowed, and even that noise echoed in my head. It felt wrong, unnatural, like I'd stumbled into a place where sound didn't belong. I tried to shake it off, telling myself this was just how it was up here in winter. But my skin prickled, and I started moving again, crunching across the crusted snow, if only to make some kind of noise to prove the world was still there. But after a while, I noticed something else. My own sounds didn't carry. Normally, when you walk in snow, the crunching carries outward, bouncing off trees, traveling across the open land. But here, it felt swallowed. Each step stopped right at my boots, vanishing into the still air. I tapped my snowshoe hard against the crust just to test it. Nothing. The noise didn't travel more than a foot from me. That's when the panic started to creep in. My rational brain said it was just the conditions. The cold air, the stillness, the way sound moves differently in the Arctic. But my body didn't care about science. My body felt hunted. My body felt like I'd walked into some kind of vacuum where I wasn't supposed to be, and something unseen was waiting for me to realize it. I kept walking, quicker now, but the more I moved, the louder I sounded to myself. My breath roared in my ears. My pulse throbbed. I could hear the saliva moving in my throat when I swallowed. Every part of me screamed with noise, and the land around me gave nothing back. It felt like I was the only living thing in existence. I stopped again and tried to calm myself. I bent down, scooped a handful of snow, and rubbed it in my gloves, hoping the gritty sound would break through the strangeness. It didn't. The snow hissed faintly and died in the air. I looked out over the flat tundra, and for the first time in my life, I wished I'd see a bear, a wolf, even a moose. Anything to prove I wasn't standing alone in a world that had gone hollow. But there was nothing, just the pale horizon, the frozen ground, and me. I thought about turning back then, heading for the cabin, shutting the door, and letting the normal creaks of the stove and the crackle of wood soothe me. But something in me resisted, a kind of stubbornness, maybe. I didn't want to run from silence like it was a predator. I wanted to stand in it, face it, prove I wasn't weak. So I kept walking, pushing further across the open land. Minutes dragged. My sense of time broke apart without sound to anchor it. I walked until my legs burned, then stopped and stood, waiting. The silence didn't ease. It got heavier. My chest hurt from breathing too hard, and sweat started to bead under my hat despite the cold. That's when the thought hit me, sudden and sharp. I could die here, right now, and nobody would ever know. My body would lock up in the snow, hidden under drifts, maybe found years later, maybe never at all. My name, my life, would vanish into this quiet, swallowed hole. The land wouldn't even notice. I felt my stomach twist, and for the first time I truly understood what fear in the wild was. Not fear of teeth or claws or freezing to death. Fear of erasure. Fear of being so completely alone that the world wouldn't even acknowledge your end. I turned back. My snowshoes crunched. My lungs pulled air like bellows, but the silence clung. The trail I'd left was faint, wind already beginning to blur it, but it was there. I locked onto it, moving faster, almost jogging despite the drag of the snow. My muscles ached, but I didn't stop. I needed walls, a roof, the scrape of my chair against the floorboards, the hiss of the stove. I needed proof that sound could still exist. When the outline of my cabin finally appeared, a squat shadow against the pale land, my legs almost gave out. I stumbled up the steps, ripped the door open, and fell inside. The bang of the door slamming behind me nearly made me cry with relief. It was sound, sharp and real, filling the space around me. The stove creaked. The floor groaned under my boots. My breath echoed in the small room, and for once, I welcomed the racket. I sat down hard on the bunk, chest heaving, sweat freezing against my skin, and I stayed like that for a long time, just listening to the tiny noises of my cabin and reminding myself that I was still in a world where sound lived. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what had happened. Maybe it was just the conditions, like I'd told myself. Maybe the stillness of the tundra in deep winter can really choke out every sound, swallowing it in a way that feels impossible if you haven't lived it. But the feeling didn't fade. The memory of that crushing silence still sits with me. Predators don't scare me like that. Cold doesn't scare me like that. But the thought of standing out there, in that vacuum of nothing, with my own heartbeat and breathing roaring in my skull, that terrifies me. Because in that moment, I wasn't just alone. I was erased. And that's the truth about living in a place like this. People talk about bears, blizzards, ice cracking under your feet. Those things are real, yes. But the scariest thing I've ever faced in Alaska is silence. Silence so deep it makes you feel like you're the last human on Earth. And even the land doesn't care if you vanish. When I think back on it now, I realize how reckless we were. At the time, urban exploration felt like nothing more than adventure. Old buildings, abandoned factories, half-collapsed houses, we wanted to see it all. There was something about walking through forgotten places that pulled me in, like stepping into another layer of the world most people ignored. That night, though, in the church, I learned how quickly that thrill could turn into something I wish I'd never seen. The church was on the edge of town, tucked back behind overgrown trees and cracked pavement that hadn't seen cars in years. The roof sagged, windows smashed out, boards peeling and rotting in the damp air. From the outside it looked lifeless, but when the sun went down and shadows filled the open holes where stained glass once had been, it gave off a different kind of energy. It wasn't supernatural, I never believed in that. It was the danger of going somewhere that no one had maintained for decades. We got inside through a side door where the lock had been broken long ago. The air was stale, heavy with mold, old wood, and something else I couldn't quite name. Our flashlights cut across the wide sanctuary, catching broken pews and piles of debris. Bits of plaster littered the ground from where the ceiling had given way in spots. Each step echoed too loud, bouncing off the tall walls and reminding us how empty the place really was. On the second floor, that's when I noticed it. A circular motif in the middle of the floor, as if it had once been the spot for a podium or altar. The wood there looked different, worn smoother than the rest, as if people had stood around it for years. But what made my chest tighten was what covered it. Dark, wet streaks smeared across the grain, unmistakably fresh. It wasn't paint, it wasn't rust, it was blood. At first I thought maybe an animal had been dragged across it. A raccoon, a stray dog, something that had crawled in and died. But there was no carcass, no trail leading to or from the spot. Just the blood, pooled and streaked like something had been killed there, not long before we arrived. I crouched down to look closer, and the smell hit me. Metallic, sharp, unmistakable. That was the moment the excitement of exploring flipped. My mind wasn't thinking about photography or adventure anymore. It was thinking about what else might be inside that building with us. Someone had been there, maybe still was. We pushed deeper anyway. Curiosity is a stubborn thing, even when common sense tells you to leave. The basement was next, stairs groaning under our weight as we went down. The air grew colder, damper. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady echo. The basement stretched in long hallways of stone, with small rooms branching off, some filled with broken furniture, others just bare walls and dirt floors. That's when it happened. Above us, sharp and sudden footsteps. Not just one or two creaks of settling wood, but the pounding rhythm of someone running. They started overhead and moved fast, crossing the floor of the sanctuary where we had been minutes earlier. My heart jumped into my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. We froze, flashlights shaking slightly in our hands. The sound was clear. Heavy boots, sprinting across the floor, circling, then fading, then returning. The church wasn't big enough for the noise to be imagined. It was real, and it was happening right above our heads. I felt the instinct to move, but every direction seemed wrong. If we ran up, we'd have to face whoever it was. If we stayed in the basement, we were cornered. The only exit we had seen was the same side door we entered, which was back upstairs. I kept trying to convince myself it could have been another explorer, someone just like us, but the blood upstairs wouldn't leave my mind. We waited, ears straining, but the running didn't continue. Silence crept back in, but it wasn't comforting. It was heavier than before, charged, like the whole building was waiting with us. We finally worked our way back up, slow and deliberate. My hands were slick with sweat on the flashlight, every step on the old stairs louder than I wanted it to be. At the top, the sanctuary looked the same as before. Pews broken, dust floating in the flashlight beams, but now it felt different. The circular spot on the floor was still there, blood still shining wetly in the beam. No one was visible, but the tension in the air made me feel like we were being watched. We didn't linger. Moving fast but not running, we crossed to the door we'd come through. The whole way out, I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone step out of the shadows. By the time we burst into the open air, the night didn't feel suffocating anymore. Even the cold breeze was a relief compared to the thick stillness inside. We didn't stop moving until we were back at the car, doors locked, headlights on, gravel spitting from under the tires as we pulled away. Only then did the adrenaline start to ebb, leaving behind a sick, shaky exhaustion. None of us said a word on the drive back. We didn't have to. We all knew what we had seen, what we had heard. Later, when I thought about it, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe the blood was from a hunter who brought in an animal to butcher, using the space where no one would bother them. Maybe the running upstairs was another group exploring, trying to spook us. That's the logical explanation. But logic doesn't erase the memory of that sound. Pounding feet above us in an abandoned church where no one should have been. I never went back. Even now, years later, the image of that circular spot with blood smeared across it stays sharp in my mind. The silence of the basement before the footsteps broke it apart. The sensation of walking out, certain eyes were on us the whole time. People always assume the scariest part of urban exploration is the danger of collapsing floors or rusty nails. They don't think about what happens when you step into a place that someone else is already using for reasons you don't want to understand. That night taught me that. And when I remember the church, it isn't the broken pews or the crumbling walls that stand out. It's the sound of running feet in a place where no one should have been, and the knowledge that we left without ever seeing who or what they belonged to. That's what makes me certain we were lucky to walk away at all. I remember that hike in Transylvania like it was yesterday, even though decades have passed since then. It was the early 90s and I was still in school. A group of us decided to go on a mountain trek, one of those long hikes that felt more like an adventure than anything else. We had no phones, no internet, and barely enough gear to make it through the climb, but back then that didn't bother us. We were young, full of energy, and eager to prove we could handle being out in the wild. The trail stretched on forever, winding higher into the mountains. By the time we had gone about 12 to 14 kilometers, we were deep into the wilderness. The trees seemed to close around us, the path fading into uneven stretches of grass and rocks. It felt like we had stepped into a world completely cut off from everything we knew. The silence was heavy, only broken by the crunch of our boots and the occasional bird. That was when we saw it, the house. At first it looked almost like a shadow through the trees, something you could mistake for part of the forest. But as we got closer, the outline became clearer. A house with a barn next to it. It was strange enough on its own because we knew how far we had come. This wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see anyone living. Yet there it was, complete with a small fenced area, a couple of cows, and some chickens pecking around. Smoke wasn't coming from the chimney, and the place didn't look abandoned. It looked lived in. We slowed down, unsure of what to do. Curiosity pulled us closer, even though our instincts were warning us to stay away. As we approached, people started to come into view. There was a man standing in front of the barn and several women, maybe 5 or 6 of them, lingering behind him. I couldn't tell if there were more inside the house, but the sight alone made my stomach tighten. The man stepped forward to greet us. He looked rough, with weathered skin and clothes that looked like they belonged to another time. When he spoke, his words were broken, his accent heavy, and we could barely understand him. It was clear he didn't see people from outside very often. The women behind him kept their distance. They stood together, watching us but not moving closer. Their faces were blank, almost dull, like they weren't sure how to react to strangers. At one point, the man asked who the president was. It was such an odd question that it made the whole thing feel even stranger. He also offered us milk, motioning to the cow behind him. My friends and I glanced at each other, and the unease grew. Something about the way he looked at us, our clothes, our shoes, made it clear we were outsiders in every sense. It was like he was studying us, comparing us to himself, as if we were from another world. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the whole situation. It wasn't just that they lived without electricity, gas, or any modern comfort. It was their expressions, the distance of the women, and the way the man seemed to guard them. They didn't behave like a family. They behaved more like a group living under rules we didn't understand. We tried to keep calm, nodding and pretending to be polite, but paranoia was creeping into every thought. Were there more of them inside the house? Were we being sized up for something? My mind kept flashing through possibilities, none of them good. My friend was the first to break away from the tension, saying firmly that we didn't want milk and that we needed to keep moving because it was getting late. We turned and walked away calmly, trying not to show our nerves. My legs felt heavy, like every step took effort, but I forced myself not to look back until we were a fair distance away. When we finally judged that we were out of their sight, the calm broke. We ran. We bolted down the path as fast as we could, pushing through brush and tripping over roots, our breaths ragged and hearts racing. It was pure panic driving us. After hours of putting distance between us and that house, we finally stopped. The sun was dropping, and we had no choice but to set up camp. None of us wanted to admit it out loud, but the fear lingered. We set up a watch rotation that night, each of us taking turns staying awake while the others tried to sleep. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent shivers down my spine. I kept imagining figures moving through the dark, following us, waiting for the right moment. By morning, nothing had happened, but the unease never left. The rest of the trek down felt long and exhausting, not because of the trail but because of the weight of what we had seen. We finally reached the villages at the base of the mountains, desperate to tell someone about what we'd found. When we described the house, the barn, and the people, the locals shook their heads. They told us flatly that nobody lived up there. Those mountains were empty, they said. Nobody had a house in that place. We insisted, but they didn't believe us. To them, it was impossible. Maybe that was the most disturbing part, that what we had seen was something even the people living at the edge of those forests didn't know about. Even now, decades later, I can still picture that man's face, the strange blank looks of the women, and the eerie silence of that mountain home. I wonder sometimes who they were, how long they had been living up there, and what would have happened if we had stayed longer. The thought of accepting that milk, stepping inside their house, or even lingering too long makes my chest tighten. We were young and lucky, nothing more. Lucky we kept walking. Lucky we didn't let curiosity trap us. Lucky we never went back. Because to this day, when I think of those mountains, I don't remember the beauty of the trail or the thrill of the hike. I remember the feeling of being watched, judged, and measured by people who seemed cut off from everything normal, and I remember the cold certainty that if things had gone differently, we might never have come back down at all. It's strange how some nights stay burned into your mind, no matter how much time passes. This happened roughly 7 years ago, but I can still remember it in detail. The smell of wet pine in the air, the sound of gravel under my tires, and the way the woods seemed to press in closer than usual. I lived far outside of town back then, down a back road that hardly anyone used unless they knew it was there. Most of the drive was through thick forest, miles of trees on either side with no houses, no lights, just dark silence. It was the kind of place where anything could happen and no one would know for hours, maybe even days. That night, I was driving home after a long shift. It was close to midnight, and the air was damp from rain earlier in the evening. Fog clung low to the ground, the kind that made my headlights look weak and hazy. My body was heavy with exhaustion, but the silence of the woods had a way of keeping me on edge, alert. I'd made that drive so many times before, but I never fully relaxed until I was pulling into my own driveway. I had about 2 miles to go when something jolted me awake. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement along the treeline. I slowed down, thinking it was a deer about to cross, but what stepped out wasn't an animal. A figure came into view, stumbling toward the edge of the road. As my headlights washed over them, I realized it was a woman. She was filthy, her clothes torn, her arms streaked with blood and dirt. She looked like she had been running for miles. My stomach flipped. Out there, that deep in the woods, she had no reason to be. The way she raised her arms, the panic on her face. It was obvious she was desperate for help. Without thinking, I hit the brakes. Gravel sprayed from my tires as the car lurched to a stop just past her. She ran to the passenger side and yanked at the handle. When she climbed in, the smell hit me first, sweat, blood, and the damp rot of the woods clinging to her skin. She curled into the seat, shaking uncontrollably, her chest heaving like she couldn't catch her breath. I kept glancing at her and then at the road behind us, trying to piece together what had just happened. It didn't take long for her to force out bits of what had happened between ragged breaths. She'd been with her boyfriend. They'd fought. He'd beaten her. She ran and he chased her. She had barely gotten away. The words hit me like a punch. I gripped the wheel tighter, scanning the dark treeline outside my headlights. Every shadow looked like it could be someone stepping out. My pulse raced, the idea of him still being out there, maybe even close enough to see where she had gone. I didn't wait around to think. I pressed the gas and the car shot forward. My whole body was tense, shoulders tight, hands slick on the steering wheel. She sat hunched against the door, rocking slightly, her hair hanging in clumps over her face. Every so often, she twisted to look behind us, her eyes wide and wild. I grabbed my phone at the next straight stretch of road, called the police, and told them everything in a rush. My voice cracked, my words uneven. I told them there was no way I was stopping on that road to wait, not when he was still out there. They told me to go straight to the hospital, that officers would meet us there. That drive felt like it lasted hours. Every bend made me nervous. Every dip in the road made me check the mirrors. My imagination kept running wild, him bursting out of the woods, throwing himself in front of the car, or headlights suddenly appearing behind me, chasing us down. The woman kept shaking, her arms wrapped around herself, blood dripping onto my seat. I didn't dare slow down. When the town lights finally appeared through the fog, relief hit me so hard it almost made me lightheaded. I turned into the hospital entrance where 2 police cruisers were already waiting, their lights flashing silently in the night. Nurses rushed to the car as soon as I stopped. They got her out, supporting her weight as she half collapsed into their arms. The police came to my window asking quick questions: where, when, how. I gave them everything I could remember, though my mind was still buzzing, stuck on the image of her running out of the woods. By the time I got home, the sky was already beginning to lighten. I sat in my driveway for a long time, hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the faint streaks of blood on the passenger seat. I didn't sleep at all that morning. My body was exhausted, but my head kept replaying the whole thing over and over. In the days after, I learned she survived. Her injuries were bad, but she pulled through. The police caught him not long after, still hiding out in those woods. For a while, I felt relief, but as the weeks went on, the weight of that night stayed with me. It's been 7 years now, and I still think about her sometimes. I still wonder how her life turned out, if she ever really got away from him, not just physically but in every sense. I hope she found safety, that she found a life where she doesn't have to run anymore. But more than that, I think about how close it came to being worse. If I had driven by a minute earlier or later, if I hadn't stopped, if she hadn't gotten away, that road doesn't feel the same anymore. Every time I drive it, I find myself scanning the trees, half expecting another figure to come stumbling out, broken and desperate. The woods have a way of hiding things. They look quiet, peaceful, but they can swallow screams, cover footsteps, and keep secrets better than any locked door. That night showed me how quickly the calm of a late drive can shift into something I'll never forget. Even now, all these years later, I still hope she's okay. I hope she found her way out of that darkness for good. But there's a part of me that will always picture her in those headlights, running from the black silence of the trees, and that's something I don't think I'll ever be able to let go. It was late, much later than I'd planned to be out, and the road home cut straight through miles of thick forest. I lived far from town, and driving that way at night was always unsettling, but I had done it often enough that I thought nothing of it. The woods pressed close to both sides of the two-lane road, tall trees leaning overhead so their branches blocked out most of the sky. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel of light, and outside of that, everything was swallowed by blackness. I hadn't passed another car in 20 minutes. There were no houses along that stretch, no signs of life. Just endless trees, the hum of my tires, and the faint rattle of gravel flicking up from the road shoulder. The longer I drove, the more aware I became of how isolated I was. If something went wrong, if my car broke down, there would be no help for miles. That thought always made me uneasy, but I pushed it aside and kept my eyes on the road. It was around the last curve before the long straightaway that I saw her. At first, she looked like nothing more than a dark shape in the distance. Then my headlights washed over her, and I realized it was a woman standing in the middle of the lane, waving her arms. She looked frantic, like she was desperate for me to stop. My stomach dropped. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, a lone woman at night. It didn't make sense. She wore dark clothes, messy, her hair hanging over her face. She stumbled forward as my car approached, motioning wildly. My instincts clashed with each other. One part of me wanted to slam the brakes to see if she was hurt, if she needed help. But another part, the deeper, sharper part, warned me that something was wrong. Everything about it felt off. The way she had appeared so suddenly, the way she kept her head low, the way the woods seemed too quiet. I slowed down but didn't stop. My headlights swept over her, and in that instant, I noticed something that made my skin prickle. She wasn't looking at me at all. Her eyes kept darting to the trees. That detail locked into my brain, and a sick feeling twisted in my gut. I eased into the opposite lane, keeping my speed steady, and drove around her. She didn't throw herself at the car, didn't scream. She just stood there, lowering her arms as I passed, her head turning slightly like she was watching me. As soon as I cleared her, I pressed harder on the gas. My heart thudded against my ribs, and my hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly they ached. My rearview mirror caught the faint outline of her figure standing in the middle of the road, but then I noticed movement. Shadows shifting just beyond the reach of my taillights, shapes slipping back into the trees. That was when I knew for sure she hadn't been alone. The realization sent a wave of adrenaline through me. My body shook, every muscle tense. I pushed the car faster, the road rushing beneath me in a blur. My eyes kept darting between the windshield and the mirrors, half expecting headlights to appear behind me, or figures to come bursting out of the woods to block the road again. The woods seemed endless, darker than ever. Every tree looked like it hid someone. I kept imagining what would have happened if I had stopped. My car surrounded, the doors yanked open, strangers dragging me into the trees. It was too easy to picture. The silence of the woods would have swallowed everything. No one would have known. I drove harder than I ever had on that stretch, every bend in the road making my stomach flip, every dip in the pavement threatening to pull me off balance. My whole body was wired, my mind replaying the sight of her standing there, those quick glances toward the tree-line, like she was waiting for someone to move. Eventually, the forest thinned, and the first faint glow of lights appeared ahead, the edge of my small town. Relief hit me, but it was shaky, incomplete. My hands were slick with sweat, and my body ached from how tightly I'd been holding myself. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I cut the engine and just sat there in the silence, my heart still racing. Couldn't shake it. The image of her figure in the road stayed burned into my mind, and worse, the faint shapes I thought I saw slipping back into the trees. I knew what I had avoided. I knew how close I had come to something I couldn't even bring myself to fully imagine. That night changed how I looked at the woods. I had always thought of them as quiet, maybe even peaceful, but not anymore. Now I saw them differently. An endless hiding place where anything could wait in silence until the right moment. For days after, I kept wondering if someone else had stopped for her, if another car had come down that road after me, and if the driver's instincts had leaned more toward compassion than caution. The thought left me cold, because I knew what I had seen. She wasn't just lost. She wasn't just hurt. It was something else, something planned, and if I had stopped, I might never have come back out of those woods. The memory still lingers every time I take that drive. My eyes search the tree-line without me meaning to, scanning for shapes in the dark. I don't drive those roads the same anymore, because now I know what could be waiting there. The woods aren't just quiet. They aren't just empty. They hold shadows deep enough to hide anything. And sometimes those shadows aren't animals or harmless wanderers. Sometimes they're people waiting for someone like me to make the mistake of stopping. And that night, I realized how thin the line is between helping a stranger and becoming a victim yourself. I had been lucky. That's the only reason I made it home.